All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another model video here. My name is Jordan. I've got Will and Eric from our team on as well. It is MLB opening week here, and wanted to have these guys come on and talk a little bit about the baseball model, the baseball sim, talk a little bit more about how it works. Why sims are so useful in baseball, what's new this season, the strengths and weaknesses of the model. We do this at the start of pretty much every sports season here, anytime we release a big update. We did one last year as well that is up on the YouTube channel here under the MLB playlist for last season. So if you watch this, want a little bit more context, I would go check that out as well. But we've got a lot to get into here today. So we'll just go ahead and dive right in. Right off the bat, always like to start with this. I'll just ask you guys, for people that maybe aren't as familiar with us, what is a simulation, or how does our baseball sim really work? We talk a lot in a lot of our content and just some of the videos even on the site, and talk about, hey, we do play-by-play simulations. You guys want to just give a little more context on what that actually means, or what we're doing here?
Yeah, sure. So, Eric, if you want to go for it.
No, you got it.
Yeah, so basically the way our baseball sim works is we do at bat by at bat. That's the granularity that we're considering play by play. So we'll, take the game state as it is. There's the pitcher, the batter, the catcher, the umpire. We've got if there's any runners on bases, like if there's any outs, what the score of the game is. We take all of those factors and we generate predictions on like what is the probability that this at bat results in a single, a double, a ground out, a strikeout, all of those things. And then the sim will, based on those probabilities, take one. And then that updates our game state. And now the next batter comes up and we do the same thing until the game ends at the end of the ninth. And whatever team wins, that team wins that simulation. We do that thousands of times. And that's how we generate the projections that you see there in like the MyProj. That's the average of all of those sims. And then you can see like all of the individual, like what the distribution looks like of how frequently a player will score a certain amount of points in each of the simulations.
So one question I've always had here, and I don't think we've actually talked about this on one of these before. When we're running a simulation for a game, do we have like a kind of desired game output of what's going to happen in that game, and then we're simulating the plays to get to that result? Or is it really truly just kind of micro event, at bat by at bat by at bat, and we just arrive at the game outcome here?
Yeah, so for major sports, it's exactly as you described in the second part of that. It's at bat by at bat. There's no overarching forced outcome to it.
Mm-hmm.
At the end, we will do, sanity checks to make sure it's close to Vegas to see, like, obviously, if we're a full run or something off of Vegas total, there's probably something wrong. But there's no force. We're not telling it what the Vegas total is and then having it solve to get there. For major sports, we're doing it play by play just based on the historical data. And then we'll have guardrails and sanity checks as needed after that's complete. Although for other smaller sports, we do apply that approach for some like of the esports, for MMA, things like that, where it's a bit less data driven.
So when we start thinking about the like micro probability, so what's going to happen at an at bat, what are the kinds of things that end up being inputs to that? Like, how do we even start to get a sense of, with all of the different like factors that are at play here, how do we get a sense of like, is this guy going to strike out, single, double, home run, like all of the different events and probabilities that can take place there?
Yeah, so I mean, like that's like the bulk of what I've been working on lately is because there's a lot that goes into it. Because there's obviously, you can look at it, you can just take this batter strikes out, 40% of his at bats, so 40% chance. But you have to consider, is he going against a good pitcher or a bad pitcher, and is that a good pitcher in that they get a lot of strikeouts, or a good pitcher in that they just generate a lot of outs?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's obviously like wind, if it's windy, or like that affects like if the ball's going to be a ground out or a fly out or those kind of things. Like there's a lot of it. So the way we do it is we use it's a bit of a artificial intelligence machine learning model, but also just some more like standard regression models. We sort of combine them into generating the predictions based on historical data and what each of those like rates looks like historically. So if we have a batter who strikes out 40% of the time and a pitcher who strikes out 60% of his batters, we basically look at what matchups like that look like historically, and use that to guide our prediction for that event.
Gotcha. So it's almost like what are situations that resemble this one that have happened in the past, and what are the rates of what actually took place in that situation?
Right. So that's one of the models, and then there's also just a regression model that's just trained on like it just takes the inputs, and so we combine a lot of different prediction models like that. Like that's the major thing that I was upgrading this off season was
Yeah.
combining those prediction models to generate a better prediction. So instead of just using one model, it's taking sort of like a wisdom of the crowd approach.
Gotcha. Do we change anything if we have, so you mentioned an example, pitcher strikes out 60% of the time, batter strikes out 40% of the time. What if it's a situation where we are very confident in that pitcher's rate, but we're not very confident in the batter's rate? How do we deal with that? Because that's one thing that's really interesting is, we might have all these probabilities of how different factors affect a probability happening there, but our confidence in those is probably a lot different across the board as well. How do we deal with different levels of confidence for how these different factors should affect what's going to happen there?
Yeah, so there's like two ways that we sort of approach it. The first way is through like using initial regressions is what we call them. Like they're basically stabilization rates. So we're not like, say there's somebody who just is making their major league debut and they hit 3 home runs on 3 at-bats or something like that. We're not going to give them 100% chance of hitting a home run in their
Yeah.
next at-bat. We're basically adding like a level of grounding. We're giving them, I think for home runs it's like maybe 150. I don't remember the exact number, but we add those at bats at an average home run rate for the league, and that helps stabilize what their rate is. So they still get credit for hitting those 3 home runs and 3 at bats. Like that clearly indicates that you have power and your rate should be above average. But because it's such a low sample size, we're sort of regressing that down. So that's the first way. And then the other way is something that we've implemented for NBA and then we're looking into applying for MLB, which is rate variance, which is basically doing uh, more precisely on like our confidence interval. So a pitcher with a lot of data and a stable rate will have much lower variance than a batter with low data and like a shaky rate. And so that's something that we're like looking into and probably going to apply in the next month or so, which I'm pretty excited about.
Gotcha. Do you think, if we were to lean one direction or the other, do you think that the current, well, actually, I guess it's hard for me to, ask if this question for something that we're implementing in the future, but I guess what I'm trying to say is, do you think we are at the moment over or underreactive to something happening surprising, like a young player gets called up and then ends up just hitting home run after home run? Do you think the way we currently handle that would under project that player in their next game or over project that player in their next game?
So I think that's a bit separate than the previous question.
Okay.
So we did upgrade our decay rates, which is essentially like the look back period. So I feel like those are in a much better place. But there's also like I think Seiya Suzuki was the player last year who came up, and like you couldn't have over projected him to start. Like there just wasn't reliable data to do that. And he was really good and like outperformed even the high expectations that just baseball scouts had for him, beyond just like what data driven prediction models can come up with. But I think that this year we're going to be much faster at reacting to things like that, because I think that we were slow last year on getting his rate up to where it should be. And I think that's one thing that we improved quite a bit this offseason with the decay rates.
Yeah, just kind of to add to that, I think we'll be faster than last year, sort of in, I guess, that, how quickly we're updating someone like Suzuki's stats. But we'll probably still be slower than maybe, we'll be slower than sort of how it feels, I guess. Like if you see a guy hit, 5 home runs in his first 10 games, you feel like he's really good. We'll still be slower than that. But we'll be quicker than last year, where it's this, Suzuki was incredible to start the year. So,
yeah. Well, and I think that makes a lot of sense, right? If somebody, even if it feels like some guy is going nuts and nobody can stop him, there is, you want the model to regress somewhat to the mean there, because there's in all likelihood is probably not just all of a sudden the best player in baseball or anything like that. So I did also want to ask on the sim side here. So as we're going at bat by at bat throughout the game here, to what extent do you guys think context in baseball affects the probability of the way a certain at bat's going to play out. Like I think in football, that's something we talk a lot about why sims are so useful, where the game state is just so important to what play is going to get called and how the rest of the game is going to play out. Do you find that that's also true in baseball, that like the probabilities of what happens on a certain at bat can vary quite a bit based on who's on base or based on what inning it is or what score it is or anything like that?
I mean, I would definitely say lesser than NFL,
Yeah.
but it's definitely present. I mean, like if you just think about like intentional walk rate, like if if you're coming up on base in an intentional walk situation,
Mm.
that's something where normally that a bat might have totally different outcome, but because they want to intentionally walk to get the forced outs at all three bases, like you just have a much higher probability of being walked there. And that's like something that definitely like Sims capture.
Yeah, I think another big one, and potentially the biggest impact is having a player on base. Usually makes the pitcher pitch out of the stretch, which pitchers are just like not as good when they don't have their sort of full windup. And so definitely like in the sim itself, if the batter ahead of the current batter is on base, that at bat is going to be more likely to result in a hit or in a walk or something like that, just because the pitcher is going to be less effective.
Yeah, that's interesting. It seems like another reason why we would why we see batters so positively correlated to one another. I think the things that easily come to mind, obviously, like runner scoring on the same play, somebody gets a hit, knocks in a run, everybody scores, like clear positive correlation, and the lack of outs when somebody gets on base creates some of that correlation. But a batter getting on base actually making the game state easier for the next batter to get on base because the pitcher's pitching out of the stretch is something that I've never really thought of. That's kind of an interesting one. Are there other benefits that come to mind for you guys of why simulating baseball and building lineups based on these simulations is so much more of a powerful approach to building lineups than using like average projections?
Yeah, I mean, I think really the big benefit is as a result of like the scoring from DraftKings. Obviously, everyone sort of knows like correlation between batters and everything, but your mean projection, like a batter, basically every batter, if they hit a home run, will exceed their mean projection. And so if you're just building on those means, you're not sort of hitting those buckets of like, oh, this guy scored 16 and this guy scored 20, which is much sort of less normal than like a typical NBA mean projection or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely capturing those sort of like weird scoring that DK and FanDuel have, that's, I think, a big benefit.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, is like I know a lot of other optimizers will use like standard randomness, or they may modify like what distribution is being sampled for the randomness, but having the sims themselves, so like you obviously, if you have the 1 through 5 batters stacked, that's like the ideal in terms of just pure point upside.
Mm-hmm.
But like there is a lot of nuance that we're capturing when we're sampling like small buckets of sims, where it's like, okay, but how much does Aaron Judge going off like actually affect LeMahieu or Rizzo or somebody else in the order? And like, is that trade-off worth the ownership? Is, there's a lot of things that we can capture that aren't just going to be captured by like a standard normal distribution.
And I think, in talking to people on like office hours and things like that, one of the things that I always think makes the sim argument kind of click for people is just pulling up the distribution and just saying like, okay, Aaron Judge projected for 9.86. That is actually not even like a very likely outcome. It's by far not one of the most popular or most common ones here. And you couldn't really you wouldn't necessarily intuitively expect that that's the average here, just looking at the distribution, at least for me here. I mean, Eric, you mentioned here that like these ceiling outcomes are a lot of times what we're targeting here. How do we get a sense, or how do we like validate that we're getting the accurate depiction of what somebody's ceiling outcomes looks like, especially for hitters, right? Like, I think what's weird about this is these are the outcomes we care about. These are the ones we want in our lineups here, but the probability of them is so low. So how, like, the difference between somebody getting to 30 points 1% of the time versus 2% of the time is such a small, like, absolute number, but that difference in terms of how optimal they are in DFS lineups would be massive. Like, what are the checks that we do there to make sure that not just the average projections look good, but that the percentiles look good and the ceilings look good for these guys?
Right. Yeah. We have processes that we go through to just ensure that our percentile projections are calibrated well. So essentially, all we're looking for there is, like, yeah, when we predict someone's 99th percentile or 95th percentile, we want to, over a big enough sample, we want to see that, like, yeah, they're going to exceed their 95th percentile sort of 5% of the time. And so really it's just kind of matching that up and ensuring that sort of what we're predicting and how often we're predicting it to happen is actually what we're seeing in the real world, sort of given enough time for, a big enough sample.
Gotcha. So I wanted to talk a little bit here about what's new for this season, both in the model, but also in baseball. So obviously few changes coming to baseball here this year, a lot of rules changes this year. Are we accounting for all that? The shift changes, the pitch clock, some of the other changes that are going on this year, is that all updated for the Sims this season?
Yeah, so I mean, we did an interview with Max and Danny. Well, not like an interview, but we did a call with them basically, and they've been studying this quite a bit because they obviously do a lot with baseball stuff. So
Yeah.
we got to chat with them for a bit and get their input on, not only just like what do the rule changes mean, but obviously they have a good understanding of how our sim works. So being able to say, like, specifically, how should we look to implement this rule change into how our sim works?
Yeah.
And I feel like really good about the takeaways that we got from that meeting.
So I'm curious, like, what are some of the most impactful changes here? Or do you expect that the changes this year are going to kind of dramatically change baseball DFS here, or how our simulations work? Like, what are some of the impacts of that?
I would say definitely the stolen base changes are pretty impactful. I think, it's not necessarily like really what we're expecting is just for there to be more stolen base attempts, and then people are going to be more successful at it. And so, like, there isn't necessarily like a big sort of key takeaway, but
Yeah,
I think from a DFS perspective, just more of like the fantasy points that are scored will be as a result of stolen bases. I don't know if Will has sort of a deeper thought than that, but I think that's really the biggest one, sort of as it pertains to DFS.
Yeah, and that's one that I'm real interested in seeing. Like, I feel like I like where we've set like what our adjustments are for them, but I'm also excited to see how the data starts to come in on like what the reality looks like for both attempts, because I feel like right now we're sort of splitting the impact between both attempts and success rate, and I'm interested to see, like, as we start getting like live regular season data, because I feel like spring training data, Eric mentioned this when we were talking about it before, but like teams are more incentivized to just take more stolen base attempts just to like see what can we get away with and sort of limit test a bit. And so getting some regular season data, I'm excited to see if the split is really about even between attempts and success, or if it favors one more than the other.
And is that like a pitch clock kind of thing where that's coming from, that we think people are going to be attempting and successfully stealing bases more, or where's that coming
Well,
from?
so we know success rate's going to go up because it's like bigger bases. And if your success rate goes up, you're more incentivized to attempt it. So I think that's at least my perception of like why both of those would increase.
Yeah, it's kind of a combination of the bigger bases, which like
Gotcha.
they've they like test run a bunch of these rules in the minor leagues, and so there is some data on, like, it doesn't seem like they increase the size that much, but in the minor leagues, like it did make an impact on how often steals occurred and then how successful they were. And then really the other thing I think is just they limited like the pickoffs basically.
Yeah.
So you can no longer just like have someone on first base and throw over 5 times in a row. And so I think those two things kind of in conjunction should make us see more stolen bases.
That's interesting. I wonder if that would ultimately, like, if teams come to realize that it's just much easier to steal bases, if it will change the way they have their batters like approach their at bats and like play for maybe getting on base a little bit more. I know like it's kind of become a little bit of a home run or strikeout league, and that's just what you hear a lot. I don't know. It's interesting to see like, if
I think it'll
change.
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting. Like, I know on our call with Max and Danny, they brought up that like Trey Turner had like a 90% steal success rate, and so now like you make the bases a little bit bigger, and it's like how high can he go? Basically, like is every time he gets on base is like if he can steal 98% of the time, like are they just going to send him every time? Like that would be extremely valuable in DFS. So
yeah,
we'll have to see.
It also, I'm interested. I'm thinking about how that would affect correlations. Like I wonder if a stolen base threat is a little bit less correlated to his teammates. Maybe just has the ability to get that upside outcome without the rest of the offense really needing to go. Like it almost seems like Trey Turner and like Acuna or other guys that can just really steal bases maybe are a little bit better options for one-offs or things like that.
But counterpoint, they'd be moving themselves into scoring position.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. So, Will, you had touched on it a little bit here as we were talking about just like the probabilities of at-bats, but I wanted to hear a little bit more about what you guys have been working on apart from just the rule changes for this season. So, like, what is new for the sim and the model this year? And I apologize if you end up having to repeat yourself just a little bit, but I think it'll help me and anybody watching here get a better idea of what we've been working on.
Yeah, so I had sort of two big changes. The first one is a bit easier to explain, so I'll start there. It was the decay rate optimizations that we talked about, and also hand in hand with the initial regression values. So how much are we regressing, limited sample sizes, etc. So both of those things are like live, and I'm really excited about them. And I feel like they're once we figured out, the new method for calculating them, like their application wasn't difficult, but they have really big impacts. I think being able to like more quickly adapt to data, but know that we're not overreacting to a small sample size, like finding that optimal tuning rate is really powerful. And I was really excited just at like looking in our stats-based backtest, like how much our accuracy improved there. So that's the first part, and then the second part is a much bigger project, and please stop me if I get too technical with it. But basically, a problem that we've had for a while is dealing with collinearity, and that's just basically like you have Rockies batters that have most of their at bats in cores, and now they're playing an away game and they're not in cores. So obviously, we can't just use their stats, because if you have half your at bats in cores, you're going to look like a much better batter. And so we've been trying to deal with that obviously like this entire time, but it is tricky to separate something like that. And so the new approach that I'm working on, that's not quite live yet, but likely to be live tonight or tomorrow, is a better way to handle those issues. So it's a mix of a bunch of different technical things, but basically making sure that we're giving the proper credit to the proper area. And that is like very tricky. And I given how hard it has been for us, and a lot of like we've consulted multiple people and like got their inputs on it, I can't imagine many people do this portion of it well. So I'm really excited that we have a really strong implementation for it. And I'm really excited to see how it works out.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. So I want to talk about the second thing you said there first. So if I'm understanding this correctly, it's basically like, what after we have an outcome that actually takes place and it becomes data for us to use, like how are we figuring out what factors are most to, you said credit, right? For what the particular outcome was.
Yes. I mean, if you think about it, it's like you have a really good pitcher right? But then how
Mhm.
much of his pitching is like because he's a lefty? Like, so how much of like what happened is because he's a lefty facing a righty, or something like that, or how much of like if it's a negative outcome, how much of that is because he was facing another lefty? And so there's a lot of like factors like that where it's nearly impossible to separate, like if someone is a lifelong Rockies player, to separate their stats from cores.
Mhm.
But then you also like not only just have that relationship to worry about, but on each at bat their relationship with the pitcher, and how like things like their handedness and the wind, like if it's a very windy day, that obviously impacts a lot
Yeah.
of things. So this basically just helps us do a better way of assigning credit to all of those factors based on their input value, as well as like get less caught up. Because I think part of the issue that we had last year was with like Rockies batter, that they're just the most profound example.
Connor
But
Joe.
right, yeah, when
Yeah.
Rockies batters weren't at home, we were just too high on them.
Uh-huh.
Because we had a hard time giving enough credit to the Coors Park versus the Rockies batters themselves. And I think that's something that with this update we'll do a lot better.
Gotcha. And in that, using that particular example, if we ended up finding that Coors was to credit for a lot of like the success on offense, that would also affect that visiting teams coming to Coors would get a bigger bump because there's actually more to give them. Like we've determined that this is a
Exactly.
greater factor than we were originally thinking.
Yep.
Gotcha. So on the regression and the decay rates, you mentioned obviously big benefit there is that we just adjust to new information a little bit quicker. I think one thing that you said that was really interesting to me is that in our back tests, this has been performing really well. How do we back test something like this? I think I'm going to do my best to articulate the question I have here. But obviously, like if we are back testing a season of data, so we're starting with opening day last year or something, for example, we know what happened the rest of the season already. So, like, how do we kind of protect against letting the actual results that we knew ended up happening there from influencing the way that we simulated out the season? Like, in other words, I wonder if our back test could end up coming up as more accurate because we like knew what was going to happen and that ended up in the data there.
Right. I mean that's always a risk. There's always like look forward bias and things like that.
Okay.
So there's like a couple different ways. And so when I say back test, what I was referring to is our back test of our stats. So this wasn't resimming every game. This
Gotcha.
was we have our input data that goes through our projection script is what we call it. And in that we can track sort of like every observation of like the home run rate. And so we track what our prediction was at the time of the home run rate and then what the observation was. And so at the end of the projection script, we have whatever, like 105,000 at bats that got checked for home run rate. And we can check, obviously, like what our average prediction versus the average outcome was. And then as well, like a bunch of summary like statistics that basically tell us like how strong our accuracy was for that metric. And so that's what I was saying we got a pretty big improvement on using the optimal decay rates is our accuracy metrics, like for each of those stats got like significantly better. And I think that we do obviously like there is like some look forward bias just in like how we like program and solve for optimal decay rates, but
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we do a pretty good job of like there are like some techniques to separate out like your test sample from your training sample and things like that, and we do try to take all those precautions that we can, because there is like you don't want to overfit your data, but you also don't want to underfit your data. You
Mm-hmm.
don't want to not give it enough information to find the right patterns and find the right values for everything. So that's the line that we're trying to balance.
Gotcha. Interesting. I One question I had, and this is just probably my kind of lack of understanding of some of this stuff. When you talk about like the observed versus the predicted, can you just like define those for me or give me a little more context of what the observed result is and
Yeah.
what the predicted
So like
means?
for example, like if it came up like when it's going through all of the plays from like let's say last season,
Mm-hmm.
it gets to an at bat, and it's like let's say Jorge Mateo is batting, right?
Yeah.
And it says, okay, we've generated a 1.5% chance that he hits a home run on
Mm-hmm.
this at bat. that 1.5% gets added to our predicted list, which is like a list of all of our predictions.
Mhm.
And then the outcome, which was likely not a home run, gets
Yeah.
added. That goes in as a 0 to our observed. So then at the end, when we've gone through all of our plays, we have a list for each stat of predicted and then the observed. So like what our prediction was at each step and then what the actual outcome was.
I gotcha. So then we just want to make sure that those averages actually then kind of add up. Is that correct?
Yes, it's a mix. We want to make sure that obviously our average prediction of a home run rate is the same as what the average actual home run rate is. But beyond that, we also want to like there you can have the same average and less or more accurate. Like if I just predicted the average home run rate for every batter, my averages would line up, but my accuracy would be bad. So there is like a bunch of different statistics that go on from there that we're measuring to try and obviously make sure that our average value is correct, but that we're getting the nuance at each prediction as well.
Gotcha. Interesting. Okay. That's interesting. I'm going to have to think about that a little bit more. That's cool. I wanted to ask here a couple other things here. So first of all, we had talked, I think, last year quite a bit about like rotations, pitching rotations, and just the bullpen here in general. Obviously, it feels to me like when we're talking about context in the sim, that is like a big break point in a game sim where the game state changes significantly, or at least in general probably would, once the starting pitcher comes out and somebody from the bullpen comes in, or each time somebody from the bullpen comes in after that. How do we model that? How do we assess what pitcher is likely to come in and when the starting pitcher is likely to get pulled, and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I can take that one. One of my big projects last year was the pitcher pull model, and it's something that like I'm really proud of. And so, I mean, really, what we're looking at when pulling a pitcher is basically how well are they pitching, and then how many pitches have they thrown, and what that kind of works in tandem with is sort of through our projection script. The more times through the order, the less effective a pitcher gets. And so sort of by the time they're at the end of their leash per se, they're not going to be as good as usually the reliever that's either replacing them or as good as they were sort of at the start of the game. And so in, those spots where a pitcher is being replaced, for the most part, the reliever coming in is going to be like better than the pitcher that sort of they're replacing. And so, yeah, all of that is like back tested on actual data and looking at when do pitchers get pulled and stuff like that. And actually, interestingly, and this was one of my big takeaways from that, one of like the big determinants of if a pitcher is going to get pulled or not is if they're at the end of an inning. So like if they've pitched the whole inning, that's usually when a pitcher is going to get pulled. And so that actually somewhat helps in DFS, where sort of if you start to get a big inning going, like, in that second, third time through the order, usually that starting pitcher is gonna stay until he's either been like blown up, or until the inning is over, and you sort of lose some of that correlation
Interesting, yeah,
within your batters. So definitely like an important piece of DFS, and I think like that's sort of the more important part. I think we do have some improvements we can make to sort of who we're selecting as that incoming relief pitcher. But I think the more important side from a DFS perspective is getting sort of like the when of that pitcher being pulled.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I mean, that's another thing that strikes me as a big benefit to just having Sims here in general, like the ability to pick up on that brief period of time in a game where there's this opportunity to basically just hit off a pitcher like really hard. An average projection is certainly not going to be able to pick that up, but even like a ceiling projection or something like that is not going to be able to pick up that context in that exact moment of the sim where that high scoring opportunity exists. Another thing that comes to mind on the pitching rotations, like obviously a guy like Corbin Burns is probably going to get a little bit more of an opportunity to stay in a game where he's struggling early than like some, fifth guy in the rotation guy, or we kind of taking that into account, like how often certain pitchers individually are allowed to stay in the game, or how often certain managers are more likely to leave some of their pitchers out there compared to others.
Yeah. So definitely like one of sort of like the starting inputs is essentially how long we like sort of our initial guess of how many pitches this guy's going to throw.
Mm-hmm.
And so for someone like Burns, like, yeah, if he gives up 3 runs in the first inning, the manager's going to throw him right out there for the second inning, and he'll probably get 3 strikeouts.
Yeah.
Versus, one of these back of the rotation guys, there's definitely a lot more of a chance that they're going to be pulled after something like that. And so, that's reflected in sort of our initial guess of how many pitches we think the player's going to throw.
Gotcha. You mentioned that you wanted to do a little bit more work on deciding like who's coming out of the bullpen. How does that work at the moment? Does it, I guess a big question I have is does it take into account who's pitched recently? I know that's something we've talked about here quite a bit in some of the past years here. I know in the past it did not. Has that changed this year at all?
Yeah, so it's right now it is still a fairly simplistic model, and
Okay.
like Eric said, it's something that's on our like short-term to-do list. So we
Yeah.
have a pretty good method in mind for updating it. Right now, we have a list of who the relief pitchers are, and we have who has thrown pitches recently.
Okay.
And we're essentially removing ones that have thrown pitches recently, and then the remaining relief pool is who can be randomly selected from. And that's something that like we can definitely improve. And that's something that is like I said, all that we're going to be tackling soon. But yeah, so right now it does remove pitchers who are like that have thrown too much recently. So we won't just be like playing the same relief pitcher over in that, but beyond that, it is still fairly simplistic.
Gotcha. I think, I mean, from what I remember from where we were at last year, I think that's already an improvement. Because if I remember correctly, I don't even think last year we were really looking into the like who's pitched recently. I know for MLB showdowns, like one thing I would always do is go through and check my list of relief pitchers I was getting in like utility spots against who threw in the last couple of days.
Right. I think that's still going to be a good thing to start, but I do think that we'll be doing a much better job of that in the near, like probably a couple weeks.
Cool. Another thing I wanted to talk about here is the weather. So how does weather end up getting accounted for in the sim? I think in particular, a lot of times we're inevitably going to get that like wind game in Wrigley at some point, probably early in the season, or just one of these other like classic kind of weather spots. But weather to me seems like something that is like a little bit naturally high variance. Like even if you just get like a half inning where the wind isn't blowing as hard, it's going to change the game state quite a bit. How are we accounting for weather in the sim? What does that look like?
Yeah, so it's a bit tricky. It does fall under, it is one of the factors that I touched on earlier that goes into our new like method of assigning that thing, just because like you mentioned, like weather and park, like a wind game in Wrigley
Yeah.
do have like a lot of overlap. So it is there, but right now we do assume that the weather is, I believe it's constant through the game is the input to the sim. So
Gotcha.
we'll have the temperature and the wind direction as like what the input will be for the game. And so, like you said, it is high variance. Like it can shift during an inning and type of thing, which, we forecasts for that just aren't good enough for us to reliably predict that. But I do think as a result of that, that probably makes our individual factors a bit more regressed. So like, wind blowing straight out might, for the innings where the wind really is blowing straight out, probably have a higher rate than what we're projecting. But
Interesting. Yeah.
That input by itself is probably a bit lower because there are times when the wind is not matching what our input is, if that makes sense.
Uh-huh.
So I think that those factors are probably a bit more regressed as like a sort of way to handle that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, gotcha. One of the things I just wanted to touch on too, I'm pretty confident that we don't do this, but for games that actually have rain out risk, that's not something that's captured in the sim. We're not going to have simulations where the game got rained down or suspended or postponed or anything like that.
No, nothing like that. We do have a dome probability model, which was one of the first things I built when I joined SaberSim, which I do love my dome probability model, which is just like, looking at the forecast and recent states to see if like Texas is going to close their dome or not. But yeah, no, nothing like as far as like the rain out risk itself. We're not giving any games zero. Like we're not giving any sims zeros because of that.
Do you think that's something that could be predicted? Like, I think there's actually an interesting edge opportunity there where you've got like an elite offense that's in a great spot, but it looks a little rainy and the game is like it locks late or something like that. And you're going to get an ownership discount on this team that's just in this great spot. Like, I think in theory it would be nice to, I don't know, have that, but do you think that's like a predictive thing that we could actually come up with like a realistic probability of a game getting rained out?
I want to clarify, I'm not a meteorologist.
Yeah.
my gut instinct is you can probably ballpark it.
Yeah.
Like you can like look at how many times have they canceled games at this park and like what was the weather, and you could probably get like a rough estimate for it. I think that you do bring up a good point though. Like their mean projection, like say you were, say you think it's a 20% chance they rain out the game. So everybody's projection goes down 20%. That would obviously reduce their ownership quite a bit. But if the game does play 80% of the time, you are getting a pretty big ownership discount, if that makes sense. It's obviously you're passing through that first binary filter of are they playing the game? So like you are already like running good if they play the game.
Yeah.
But there is definitely, I think, like value there, and I'm sure there's a lot of like smart players doing that.
Yeah, because I mean the distribution for the players if they play is identical to what they just would have been. Like it basically
right. As long as we're factoring in like, I mean, so like we're factoring in the temperature, the wind, the weather, like that. So we're already like, if the wind would make them hit less home runs or whatever, like since we're already accounting for that, then they would have the same distribution.
Yeah, I think we could get a pretty good like estimation of it. I think the only sort of difficulty would be maybe understanding like, oh, this is the last game of this series and like they play tomorrow elsewhere, and so they can't just do a doubleheader or something like that, which might make them more likely to play. Like I think there is a little bit of, I don't know, just like or I guess more like qualitative data that would be difficult to kind of acquire and incorporate correctly. But yeah, it's an interesting.
Yeah, I wouldn't feel great about algorithmically predicting that probability.
Yeah. I think it'd be hard. I do think it's an interesting idea of just like having, I don't know, almost like now I'm just brainstorming stuff, but like a way that somebody could just kind of set that for themselves almost, and just like, every player is zero in this game 20% of the time, and now like build or something like that. But
yeah, that's anyway, pretty interesting.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about here the sim and the model. For people that do want to go a little bit deeper, make some adjustments to projections, do a little bit of their research. You guys know it better than anybody else. What are some of the limitations or the biases here that if somebody was kind of dead set, I want to add value to the projections here, where do you think would be a good place for that person to start?
For me, the biggest place I'd point them is like minor league call-ups or like people coming over from other leagues. I think we do a good job of like getting them in the right ballpark, but like that's definitely a value or an area where like, I mean, there isn't just like a discrete formula for like how this player is this good in AAA. What do they look like in the majors? Like you can estimate it and you can, sort of come up with it. But if you're familiar with them, like if you've watched them play in AAA and you're like, no, he's got a really good fluid stance and that's going to make him like perform, like keep up that same high level against pro pitchers as opposed to like a lower level of pitchers, that would be a great place to bump them. Or vice versa, if you think that like their game doesn't translate well to the pros, drop them.
Yeah, agreed. I think where I would sort of go is either in players who have changed teams or like specifically pitchers, really. Pitchers who have changed teams or just in general pitchers who are adding a pitch or sort of changing their pitch mix. So I think really like the famous example is pitchers go to Tampa Bay and they stop throwing their sinker and then they just become like strikeout gods. I think we're going to be slower to sort of pick up on that than if, you're following that pattern or seeing like, oh, this guy's, now added a slider and it's bumped his strikeout rate. Like I think there's some things you can do there to just kind of be a little bit quicker than the model around pitchers.
Gotcha. Is there a couple other like just fun questions I always have on my list here? Is there something that you guys have found here that is you hear a lot discussed just in like the MLB DFS space that like we just frankly don't think matters as much or isn't as predictive in terms of modeling this stuff as people let on or that as often as it gets talked about?
Batter versus pitcher.
I think that's a classic one.
I mean, I feel like I'm not like too involved in following like what people in like the DFS space are talking about, and I would like to think that has decreased in years, at least from like sharp sites or players.
Yeah.
But I still, you do see it's like, especially with people posting their underdog slips or whatever, they're like, this guy, he got 2 home runs last time he faced this pitcher, and that just doesn't matter. Like you're not gonna get a sample size really to convince me that matters more than just how good the pitcher is or how good the batter is and like the other factors at play. So I think that's one thing that like still is unfortunately prevalent that just I don't believe in.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I think it's maybe a little bit of a weird one. I don't know really how often it gets used, but I would say like sometimes the StatCast stuff gets thrown around of like, oh, this guy's hitting 110 mile per hour off the bat, like 3 times a game. And I think that's obviously like goes further than kind of what we're doing, but there is still variance in how hard someone is like hitting the ball. And likely you're trying to kind of get a lead on that variance and being like, oh, this guy's hitting it well, but he isn't getting results. And so I think I would just caution to be a little careful there, where, if someone all of a sudden has a 3-game stretch where they're just like nuking the ball, but maybe not getting hits, that might not be as predictive as you kind of think it is.
And on the flip side of that, is there anything that we find actually is very predictive here or that is surprisingly predictive for our model? Or in, I guess, like with the collinearity stuff that Will was talking about here, is there anything that as we've started that work there ends up seeming like surprisingly to credit for certain outcomes taking place?
I mean, I'm not sure like how much of it surprises me, but I still just find it interesting, like the amount to assign it. So obviously like Parks got a higher, like more of it is assigned to Parks than we were previously doing, which I just think is interesting that like, obviously I logically understand that a different park plays differently, but it just still seems like you're playing the same game.
Yeah.
You can have like a 2-run total difference if you're in Colorado versus if you're in San Francisco.
One question on that, like, so are we are separating weather and park in that
sort
system?
Of that ties into what the collinearity does. So it's separate, but then it is also like we're taking it apart and putting it back together. I don't understand it well enough to explain it simply. Is that's my own fault, but like that it's sort of like they are separate. But then if you think about when they go into the sim, they're going into the sim together.
Okay. I'll think about that one a little bit.
Give me like another like month to really sit with it and think about it, and I'll come back on and I'll pop in like on an office hours and I'll give the proper explanation.
That's perfect. I think Andrew would enjoy that as well, and maybe he'll have a better grasp on it too, and can ask some better questions here as well. So, I mean, Will, it sounds like you have your hands full with this a little bit, but if you have an answer to this question, great. But Eric, I'm interested to hear yours as well. What would be one thing, if you got the green light to just go heads down on the baseball model to fix or implement this one thing for like 2 or 3 weeks, what would be that one thing that you really wanted to add or build out for the MLB sim?
I would say, I know I just like kind of talk trash about Statcast, but I think that that would probably be just understanding like how much to weight it, and I think then too you can get at some of the like pitch mix stuff just a lot easier, which I think is kind of the next frontier for just kind of how our baseball sim is set up. So I'd say, yeah, incorporating the Statcast stuff, and honestly, like mostly on a pitcher side, I think would be the coolest.
Yeah, and for me, it's going back into minor league equivalency, which I know we talked about, I think probably 2 years ago now, was when I first talked about it. But I've obviously just like learned a lot in the 2 years since then, and I really do want to go back and tackle it and try new methods at it, because I think that it is really interesting if we can find a way to like say this player is in AA right now, but based on their stats, we think they'd be like an above average AAA player or even a serviceable like rotation player in the major leagues. And that's like obviously a bit less important for DFS in that sense. Like when it is obviously very important once they eventually get called up, like if it's for the postseasons or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I just think that it's a really interesting thing that isn't done well anywhere really. I don't think like anyone's like solved it. And I think like having that would be a really cool project.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a hard problem to solve, especially when you start thinking about how certain skill sets are going to translate and others may not. I remember you talking about that in one of these videos we did in the last couple of years. So cool. Well, I appreciate you guys as always for taking the time to come on and talk to me about this stuff. Is there before we start to wrap up, any final thoughts or anything else that you guys think we didn't really get to, or just wanted to provide a little more context, or just anything to note on your end?
I mean, not really for me. If we can move into jokes, I don't have a team to support this year. If anyone wants to sell me on what team I should be a fan of, I'm totally down.
Yeah, I unfortunately find myself somewhat rooting for the miserable Colorado Rockies every year. So I can't bring you into that in good faith.
There's no Charlotte team, so.
You could be a Jays fan.
Yeah, I'll be a Jays fan. That works.
That's at least a team that is young and exciting and wants to win games.
A lot of homers, so. Cool park. Yeah, I'm in.
That's right.
All right, go Blue Jays.
Redone. Yeah.
Well, for everybody here that's been hanging out, watching, listening along with us here for about an hour or so, appreciate you guys as well. If you stumbled upon this video and haven't checked out SaberSim before, obviously put in a ton of work and updates to the baseball model for this season. We have a free 7-day trial on our site, sabersim.com. Will and Eric, one last time, thank you guys again for taking the time. Good luck this season, everybody, and we'll see you later.